Hi ladies and gentlemen, today that I'm recording this is April 8th, 2021, and I have a light overhead. Try to give myself a little more light for reading because the other light's just too dark, and I know it really sets me off here and makes me look ablaze, but it'll help me to read a little better. As you know, we're reading my book, The Crimson Thread, The Struggle to Become Jesus During the Revolt Against Rome. It is a fictionalized romance novel, but based on historical information, as I explained many times now. So we're actually on chapter 4, and I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it. And I definitely use these. Okay, here we go. Chapter 4. A year passed, and Joseph and Miriam were content and happy. A child had been born to them, a son they named Joseph. The family lived in two places depending upon the time of year and other circumstances. In the warmer parts of the year they stayed in Capernaum, while in the cooler parts of the year they lived in Bethany. Joseph traveled often, sometimes with his uncle Joseph, at other times just to accomplish work projects around the country, as he was an architect and builder, like his father, Cleophas. In fact, Herod had used Cleophas on a number of his palaces and even parts of the temple of Herod. The fact that Cleophas never revealed nor pushed his Davidic right to rule over Israel kept him in semi-good graces with the ruling Herodians and Romans, at least as far as his business was concerned. So it was with Joseph. He often felt incensed toward the ruling classes of the Herodians and Romans, and he pretty much kept to himself, devoting his time alone to study and meditation. Often, his meditative periods would last for hours as he applied the techniques he had learned in On and Damascus and Emmaus in his younger years. But Joseph had something calling to him, and he could not refuse its refrain. While he knew that the responsibility he had of taking the throne of David was his uncle Joseph's greatest desire, Joseph had to search to find out how he could best attain it. To claim it directly and publicly would not only be dangerous, but would likely cause a greater rift in his extended family than he had already experienced. Well, he knew that Jude was claiming the kingly Mashiach position. Furthermore, while his physical condition had continued to improve, he was still not quite of a kingly stature, and certainly not strong enough to become a kingly warrior. That would change. Then there was the problem of the Torah and the community's interpretation of it. Sadly, they were the only voice in Palestine that even came close to upholding the law and having a right to do so. The problem for Joseph was their brand of asceticism and discipline that went beyond Torah requirements. In fact, Joseph felt that these beliefs were their greatest weakness. Yet, to attempt to ascend to the throne without their approval would, again, be met with failure due to the support they demanded and received from all Jews. So, Joseph remained patient. He studied the Torah diligently and prayed often. Having attended the schools at the city of On in Egypt, which were presided over by the priesthood there, Jewish, ancient, Aaronic, Levitical priesthood, he had a massive repertoire of the mystical side of the Torah, the Hebrew language, and its applications to kingly acquisitions. He knew he would need to return to On or commit to some degree at Damascus at the appropriate time and at the appropriate age prior to his final ascension to the throne. His travels and studies in foreign lands, especially the East, had polished his understanding of all these things in the light of the descent of the teachings of Abraham to others outside of Israel. Israel had, in fact, lost or misunderstood so much of it since the Babylonian captivity. His ventures around the world had brought many things regarding the secrets to his mind. His studies were not, however, limited to purely spiritual matters. He worked hard to improve his physical condition. He even requested from his uncle Joseph that he obtain an instructor for him in the ways of combat and weapons employment. He studied the wars of the Jews from Moses' time to that of the Maccabees, even the guerrilla tactics of the community revolutionaries. He did not allow himself to remain idle, as time was growing ever shorter. He was now approaching his 20th year of age. Throughout this time, the other brothers continued their resistance activities. Rome was becoming more and more adamant about controlling Judea and Galilee, while the people's anger against Rome was reaching a fever pitch. The Romans had responded by increasing troop strength and also considering sending in a new Roman governor. All the while, any hint of resistance was crushed immediately. The resistance won many skirmishes, but they could not defeat the entire Roman army. The Romans, on the other hand, realized that they needed to do more than merely occupy the land. They needed to discover the leadership of the resistance. The question was how to accomplish it. Jude, Johanan, and Jacob had been working together to determine how best to ensure the addition of new members to the community. The righteousness of the members of their resistance army was also a great concern, as they knew Hashem would bless them only if their men were pure. The success of all their plans depended on their diligence in managing these two issues and in honoring and worshiping Hashem. As they discussed these issues, it occurred to them that they needed to accomplish a feat that would endear the population to their cause. A new move was needed to impress the people with the true need for fighting back and the means to do so. It was time for a bold act, out in the open. But what should it be? Several days later, while on his way to Emmaus, Hananiah ben Menachem and several of the members of the community were attacked and killed by a Roman patrol. The Romans believed them to be members of a zealot raiding party that had attacked a Roman camp not far from Jerusalem. Their bodies lay in the ravine for several days where they were killed before a search party from Damascus found them. The community was devastated. Not only had these pious men been slaughtered without cause, but also their bodies remained unburied and desecrated. Johanan and several of the remaining elders from the council went to the Roman governor, Sepphoris, and demanded an explanation. While the community had no actual respect for the Romans or their Herodian administrators, the fact was that Herod had looked favorably upon the Essenes as a whole because of Menachem, the Essene. They had not been formally implicated in any seditious activity, and they needed to emphasize their case to the Roman and Herodian authorities. The fact was suspicions would be raised if the community did not offer a protestation before the authorities discovered whom their soldiers had killed. Sabinus had the affair investigated for the sake of Herod Antipas' son, Herod's son, and found to his satisfaction that Hananiah and his fellow travelers were not the seditious attackers that had killed many of the Roman camp. He issued a formal apology to the Jews, especially the community at Damascus, but he refused to punish the renegade Roman soldiers who had attacked the men with no real justification. They were his men whom he had ingratiated with any pleasure they might have as long as they brought the spoils and the booty to him. This was all according to the methods of Sabinus to obtain riches and power. He had now even set his plans in motion to obtain the treasure of the temple, and there were those who perceived his intentions. It was then that the community elders recognized Yochanan ben Zechariah as the Moreh HaTzedek, or teacher of righteousness. Yochanan, better known to you as John the Baptist, and several other men were chosen by lot, a vote, by remaining council members to replace those who had died. Yochanan was specifically voted as the new teacher of righteousness, and there were no dissents, even with his younger age. His zealousness was tempered by his wisdom, but he still did not hesitate to identify the true issue in his heart. He read the war scroll to the whole community, which was the plan for the war of the sons of light of the community against the sons of darkness, the Kettim, and their followers and supporters. But where would these legions of soldiers for the army of the sons of light come from? The plan was bold and broad. The community believed the end times were approaching. The people needed the kingly Mashiach to lead them into freedom, and Jude was still consolidating his support. At 20, he now commanded a respectable following that trusted his prowess, judgment, strength, and commitment to the requirements of the Davidic king as dictated by the new teacher of righteousness, Yochanan ben Zechariah. He had developed an efficient recruitment campaign for the community. Speaking in public places as a spiritual leader, he would collect followers and introduce them to Yochanan ben Zechariah, who would immerse them in a mikveh, later called baptism by Christians, or in the flowing waters of the Jordan River. This group Jude would then mind to find those willing and able to join the fighting unit he called Hashem's army. This was a very effective tool, allowing him to sort through large numbers of individuals and assess their true state of mind. Once he assured that his choices were appropriate, he would introduce them to the Messianic movement and the Zealot resistance. But this was the one area of the community's activities that was the most susceptible to Roman infiltration and intelligence gathering. While slow to react to this threat, the Romans were going to catch on soon enough. After recruiting a great number of followers through their ministry and then identifying potential zealots, Jude and Jacob found that they had the numbers and the general support to formulate bolder actions than any in their war of resistance to date. The zealots served as a core upon which they could build larger forces as an action progressed, encouraging locals and others to join in specific resistance efforts as the need developed. In this manner, they could keep an operation secret until just before or immediately after they initiated hostilities. One such event was a planned assault upon the royal armory at the palace in Sepphoris of Galilee, where Herod and the Romans kept a store of weapons and supplies. The attack, if successful, would allow Jude to seize weapons so badly needed by the resistance. It would also send a message to friend and foe alike that the resistance was strong and capable. Jude and Jacob met their closest followers south of Jotapata, a city approximately 4 miles north of Sepphoris and well situated for planning an attack against the royal armory. Sepphoris was the pride of the Galilee, located nearly in the middle of the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee, surrounded by mountains, hills, and valleys. The fact that Herod and the Catine constantly occupied it was a source of severe irritation to the people, and especially Jude, who understood its military significance. In general, the terrain made the Galilee a favorable location for resistance activities against the Catine. The resistance could engage in small and large-scale attacks and then disappear into the hills. On this occasion, Jude staged his forces in the hidden valleys and prepared them for the attack. During nighttime, in a large tent surrounded by nearly 100 men and more arriving, Jude finalized his plans with his leaders. "Here is the palace," Jude pointed to a map of Sepphoris he had constructed out of rocks and sand. "Here is the armory. The Roman garrison is here on the east side of the palace, and here are the quarters for the Herodian guard. Our objective is the armory, here, inside the palace walls. The Romans and Herod's troops heavily guard it. A sentry is in reserve at all times, located here at the southern gate. At any particular time, there are 10 Romans and 20 to 30 of the king's guards manning the entrance, watching from the tower walls, or standing about the armory. These forces are a mixture of infantry and archers. There is no cavalry." Jude motioned to his right-hand man, Laban. Laban was young, physically powerful, and extremely strong-willed. Only a leader like Jude could command him. While intelligent, he was often given to a slight impetuousness, a risk-taker. But this made him a flexible and capable field commander who could take advantage of enemy weaknesses. "We have watched the changing of the guard," explained Laban, "and we have found that it occurs twice a day, once in the morning immediately after sunrise, and again immediately before sunset. In other words, the forces are at their strongest at all times but these, because at all other times the army is secured very well. While the number of men is doubled around the armory during the guard change, the gates are opened and there is some confusion in the command and control. We plan to attack during the morning guard change on the 3rd day of the week, which is tomorrow. Although the reserve sentry is moments away, they are typically involved at this time we have planned in replenishing their supplies and are not usually capable of immediate deployment. They are unaware of this weakness or just plain stupid." He smiled and looked over at another leader, Jude's brother Kepha. "So, where will our forces concentrate?" asked Kepha. "To guarantee surprise and gain the initiative, this will need close coordination and access. I have seen the area and can't say that there is a convenient spot." "Here on the north," Jude pointed to the map, "this is the best approach. We will attack in the lingering darkness before the sun rises above the hills to the east. We will converge from 3 directions, Kepha on the left, Laban on the right, and my forces in the middle. We will make our way through the city and enter the palace at the moment the main gate is open for the supply wagon. Laban will act as a rear guard and reserve, protecting us from any surprise by a Roman sentry. He will also supply the spies and messengers to help us coordinate the attack. You, Kepha, and those with me will enter the gate and proceed directly to the armory. I have 6 men who will use a small battering ram to break down the door. As your men continue to battle what forces the Catine have in and around the armory, mine will remove the weapons. Laban will ensure the east gate is open and will make our escape to the east. The Catine will never expect such a daring act. It will take them completely by surprise." Another voice spoke in the darkness. "Barabbas!" Jude's brother Jacob called to Jude using a name of affection meaning more than just a brother but a more sure son of our father. It had a twofold meaning, one referring to their blood relation and the other Jacob's recognition that Jude was the Davidic king. "Several in the city have informed me they have enough men that once the battle begins they will join it to keep the Romans from reaching the armory. They intend to do this not only by force of their swords, but also by placing a herd of sheep and some oxen in their path. It should delay the reinforcements long enough to grant your retreat as long as you do not take too long to gain entrance. Laban's men have but to signal the battle by blowing the horns we have given them. Then we are ready, said Jude with satisfaction. Inspect your men, he instructed Laban and Kepha. We move tonight. Laban and Kepha, along with the many men who had been standing around, stepped away into the darkness. Jacob and Jude were alone. This is the big one, Jacob said. We have done many things, blessed be Hashem, responded Jude, but this will be the most important so far. If they have not murdered Hananiah, we would not have had to proceed so quickly and so mercilessly. Is Yochanan in agreement? He knows the danger, Jacob said as he lowered his head and nodded. It was a somber occasion for him. Many could die. The Romans could, and likely would, retaliate. He didn't like the spilling of blood. He had always wanted it to be the last resort. But Hananiah's murder proved that the people could never trust the Kittim and the Herodians. However, he also knows that Hashem expects us to do all we can to free ourselves and to honor his Torah. So, that is enough for that for now. Let us eat to renew our strength and prepare for what is to come. Jacob and Jude raised their hands and looked up as if to see into heaven. Jacob thanked Hashem for all they had and for providing them with their food and sustenance. The two men then sat and ate. 2 hours later, the forces were moving to Sepphoris. In all, Jude estimated the immediate forces at his command at over 1,000 men. Added to that, the men Jacob was promised in Sepphoris itself, Jude was reasonably certain of success. As Jude rounded the last hill before the city, he could see the light of the torches of the palace. Clearly silhouetted against the light were the guards on the walls. He moved his men closer to the city until he could see Kepha's forces on his left and Laban's on his right. Jacob would remain in the rear in the hills to ensure that, should anything go wrong, he could get a message to Damascus. The sun's light was just piercing the eastern sky. There were no clouds, but there was a subtle red hue to the morning light. Exactly as he predicted, the supply wagon approached the gate, and Jude waved his men to move forward. The gate opened to allow the wagon to enter, and Jude's forces rushed the guards. Laban's men began blowing their horns to cause more confusion and to signal the movement of the sheep and oxen into the likely path of any enemy reinforcements. The changing guards were, in fact, caught by surprise, and the two guard commanders began giving conflicting orders. The confusion of the Romans and Herodians was to Jude's advantage. While Laban held the gate and moved a contingent of men to the east to secure the escape route, Jude and Kepha, with their forces, fell upon the defenders. Swords and sickers slashed and stabbed. Men on both sides were yelling and screaming, falling, dying, or running. The Romans and Herodians were taking the greatest losses due, no doubt, to the surprise and confusion. But it was also obvious the virulent attacks by the Jews against the Kittim were accomplishing their destructive intentions. Pools of Roman and Herodian blood formed around their dead and dying. Roman and Herodian archers began to release their arrows, several striking the Jews who were rushing their positions on the corners of the armory building. With no armor to protect them, the arrows penetrated deep into their bodies, immediately killing 6 and wounding 4 more. But Kepha and his men turned on the archers before they could draw another arrow. As one Roman archer looked into Kepha's eyes, Kepha cut off his arm with a sword and then slashed his throat with a sickle, even before the men fell dead to the ground. Kepha's men dealt the same to the others, and in only 2 minutes Jude and his men had used the ram to break down the door and were in the armory. They took the swords and archery equipment stored in racks and in stacks around the walls of the main room and loaded them into their sackcloth bags or carried them in their arms. Men armed with sickers and swords protected the flanks of those who carried off the weapons and supplies. These all moved quickly to the east gate and escaped. Jude looked around to try and take an accounting of the situation and perceive any dangers. No enemy reinforcements had arrived. Jacob's men from the town must have succeeded. Laban held the gate and looked at Jude, who then waved him to move to the east. Kepha was already on his way to the east gate as well, his men carrying their dead and wounded. Jude then realized that there were no enemy soldiers actively fighting them. It appeared that Jude and his forces had killed or severely wounded all of the guards. If his forces could now escape in their entirety, a greater success he could not have imagined. As Jude and his men fled to the east, the Roman sentry finally arrived at the armory. There was not much they could do but secure the palace and ensure that none of the zealots remained. Their commander knew better than to pursue a superior zealot force into the hills. Such adventurism would mean utter annihilation of his command. The zealots were successful, thanks to Jude. They formed an efficient distribution system to arm all the men they could in the resistance. A price was put on the head of Jude, although the Romans were not able to accurately identify him, thinking him the son of Hezekiah instead of his real father, Cleophas. His fame as Barabbas and the Mashiach ben David was the talk of the people in all of Galilee and even Judea. After Sepphoris, Jude and Jacob returned to Damascus while Kepha remained in Galilee. The Roman retaliations that so concerned Jacob began almost immediately. It was now a war of tit for tat. Over the next several years, the community and its attached zealots carried out a widespread campaign against the Romans and the Herodians. The brethren kept silent even on threat of torture and death if they were captured. Their tenacity even amazed the Romans, who were, by far, better equipped and experienced in the art of interrogation and torture. The tactics by the resistance were, by and large, a series of guerrilla-type hit-and-run missions to disrupt communications, seize equipment or weapons, and to inflict maximum casualties. They were certainly not strong enough to confront the Roman army in open battle, although they had been successful in several minor campaigns. While the common Jews were supportive of the efforts, they could not see any real advantage to providing other than food, supplies, and shelter to revolutionaries. At times, that was even difficult because after Sepphoris, the Romans would often answer an attack upon them by raiding the closest town or settlement and killing groups of people or taking them away into slavery. It was a brutal and difficult time. With all this, Jude had other things troubling his mind. He and Rachel had not yet conceived a child. For a man who desired to be a king, especially the promised Mashiach ben David, he could not afford the absence of posterity. While not truly jealous of Joseph and Miriam, who had already had their first child, it did disturb Jude that Hashem seemed to deny him the needful fruits of his marriage. He never made Rachel feel inadequate, as he realized that he was very likely at fault for his constant movements and obligations away from home. They both talked about it frequently, comparing themselves to other ancient families who had a difficult time bringing children into the world. They tried to view it as a test of their trust in Hashem. Rachel's dedication and Jude's confidence in dealing with this developing crisis actually brought them closer together, and their love for each other grew. Jude continued his efforts to increase his alliances and gain more soldiers for the resistance. His success in these endeavors was due in part to his abilities, but also because the people were tired of Sabinus and his excuses and his excesses. Thousands, many not even Jews but others such as Idumeans, were now angry at Romans and Sabinus over his abuses of their lands and riches. Several other resistance groups now began asserting themselves against the Romans in an attempt to claim leadership over the Jews and to dislodge the Chatim. One of these was the rebel leader Simon, who had been a servant of Herod Archelaus. Simon had himself declared king and attacked the Herodian palace at Jericho. His forces burned the palace and destroyed the images it contained. They also removed what gold, silver, and other valuables they could find. After killing the attendants and servants, they departed. This Simon made several such attacks, killing Romans, other foreigners, and collaborating Jews. His fame reached Jude, who decided that he needed to attempt to consolidate the revolutionaries with his own forces. After meeting with the leaders at Damascus to secure their approval, Jude sent several dispatches to Simon that went unanswered. Jude finally decided to try to meet him and negotiate a mutual agreement. With only a small band of fighters to avoid Roman detection of their purpose, Jude set out for Galilee from Damascus. They dressed themselves as pious Essenes, which they were, but his reputation was not as yet associated with the resistance of the Zealots. So at this point, the dress allowed them to travel undetected. Through a contact in Galilee, Jude managed to acquire a meeting with Simon. It was late at night on the shores of the Sea of Galilee near some fishing boats that were anchored close to shore that rocked slowly back and forth with the gentle waves. Jude and his band made a fire and cooked some food while they waited for Simon to arrive. He did so within the hour. The designated contact approached Jude's party. The appropriate exchanges were made, and the contact disappeared into the darkness. A few moments later, Simon and his men arrived. "The legendary descendant of David," snickered Simon. Jude avoided any comment of a negative tone. He did, however, stand up, as did the few of his band that were beside him. For safety and security, Jude had placed the majority of his zealots in a hidden location near the boats to facilitate any unforeseen emergency. Simon then took a seat by the fire and helped himself to a few morsels of food. Why do I have the idea that you want me to join your pious brethren and leave my own success to offer it to you? Asked Simon. What makes you think I am desirous of that? Remarked Jude. The fact is that you have been very successful in our war on the Kittim. My desire is to ensure that we all conduct ourselves for the benefit of our people and the will of Hashem. Hashem has smiled on me, responded Simon. Besides, all I have heard you do is preach niceties to the country. Where is your scepter of power? Jude's public preaching, as his alias Yeshua, had been successful in gaining pious converts, but Simon was not apparently aware that from that group Jude had fashioned a formidable army. He did not feel inclined to let Simon know the true extent of his power. The people need hope, and I can give that to them without the necessity of too much bloodshed, said Jude. I think that, as you have already observed, I have the right to the throne of David. All I am asking is that you counsel with me before you act so that we can increase the odds of our success as a people. What you are really saying, Jude, is that you want me to be subject to you, Simon said as he tossed a pebble into the water. What is in it for me? The approval of the heir to the throne, responded Jude. Ha ha ha, Simon laughed. That and a little minnow may buy me a matzo. Simon's followers laughed along with him. Look, Jude, Simon continued, I know you are no pushover, but I think we are doing just fine on our own. You do your thing in Judea, and we will do ours here in Galilee. Divided efforts and separated forces will not win against the Kittim, Simon, Jude cautioned. Not in the long run. We need a wide-ranging and coordinated plan of action. Working together, we can conduct effective, timed, and mutually supporting actions. And who do you want me to answer to in this organization you propose? Kepha ben Cleophas, my brother, is the contact leader in Galilee, answered Jude. All coordination would come through him. Kepha, explained Simon. A man of strength he is, a man of planning he is not. No, Simon, Jude interjected. Kepha will merely be the communications coordinator. I will be directing the actions. I see, said Simon. Well, I don't think so. We will do our own fighting. Simon, you need the efforts of more than just a few you have here. You must know that some of our own from Damascus have been aiding you in your campaigns. That is really no more than an extension of what you have already managed. If I will not answer to Herod, why would I answer to a dreamer of the throne of David? Quipped Simon. Jude did not answer, but looked at Simon's followers and walked past each of them, looking them in the eye. He wanted them to see the determination in his countenance and let them ponder the wonder of a descendant of David actually before them. He then returned to Simon, who was still tossing pebbles into the water. Jude gazed at the men of Simon and could see that their minds were at work. I tell you what, Simon, said Jude. Take a few days and consider what I am saying. We have an effective plan for increasing our numbers and reestablishing the kingdom of heaven of Hashem. You would do well to become fishers of those recruits with me. Simon scoffed. He turned to Jude and looked above him to the stars now shining brightly above them as the moon had now risen. I will ponder what you have said, Jude, but I am the king here in Galilee. Any agreement I make will be as an equal to you. So for our mutual interest, I will consider your offer, but it will need to be in the terms of an alliance, nothing less. Jude was not hasty. He recognized that the kingdom had been fractured for some time. It was not easy for those from the area of the former northern kingdom of Israel to fashion themselves a part of the Davidic dynasty. Jude tried to see several moves in advance, and he was not greedy. His true interest was the restoration of Israel as a sovereign kingdom under Hashem, with the Kittim gone. Okay, Simon, why don't you think about it? We should meet again before the beginning of Av, the time of year around July and August. Fine, I will agree to meet then, said Simon. He didn't. And in a botched operation where Simon tried to attack a Roman column, he was roundly defeated and beheaded by Gratus, a commander of King Herod's troops. Jude had lost one potential ally. He would lose more. Several of Simon's followers broke away and fought battles throughout Galilee, but even though moderately successful, they were not coordinated with any major overall operation. So while they burned the royal palaces near Jordan at Beth-Ramtha, only a few of Jude's forces could assist because of the short notices, and Jude's ongoing plans to attack Sepphoris at Jerusalem. During this time of Roman weakness and general rebellion, another man named Athronges set himself up as king. The word of his actions reached Jude, who also learned that Athronges directly challenged Jude's right to the throne of David. Athrongis, a poor shepherd who had no legitimate genealogy to prove his claim, still had the support of the people because they were anxious to throw off Roman rule and would listen to just about anyone who had the right words and an army to back it up. Athrongis gathered a superior force for the time and proceeded to war against the team, the Herodians, and anyone who opposed him. He was also willing to fight Jude. After Athrongis attacked the Roman cohort at Emmaus, killing their centurion Arius and 40 of his troops, and stole their corn and weapons that the cohort was transporting to their legion, the people began to believe that he might be their Mashiach. This concerned and even angered Damascus. On more than one occasion, Jude had tried to make a pact with Athrongis, but Athrongis had no interest in placating him. Athrongis' claims to the throne made cooperation impossible, and he had 4 brothers who were as adamant in their support for him as Jude was against him. As a result, Jude and Athrongis began to fight each other at the same time they fought the Romans. The bloodshed became so pervasive that the Romans worried they would lose control of the entire province. Jews killing Jews was not so much a concern as the side effects. But the Romans learned to use the internal strife and violence between the Jews and the tumult in Jerusalem as a way to justify their continued occupation of Palestine and even increase their control. The occupation, so they stated, was to protect the people from the unscrupulous and destructive actions of the different factions in the country. This whole problem would continue for many years, but the suffering of the people only increased as Rome responded to the unrest. All that was apparent to Jude was that he needed to consolidate these efforts and point them in a concentration of forces to one objective, Jerusalem. The liberation of Jerusalem would be the catalyst for his ascension to the throne and the freedom of Israel. He tried once more with Athrongis. Surprisingly, Athrongis agreed to a truce and a meeting to discuss a confederation. They met just before Passover at Taricheae on the south side of the Sea of Galilee. This area was a famous rebel stronghold that the Romans had not yet perceived. It was noon as the 2 men approached each other with their bodyguards close by. They sat down together and tried to act like old friends. The air, however, was thick with distrust, recollections of recent battles between them fresh on their minds. "Jude, I trust Hashem blesses you and your family," Athrongis said with reasonable tones, unlike his usually boisterous manner. Jude's caution did not abate. "And likewise to you," Jude responded. He looked around quickly to check the area and noted it was clear. "I think we are sufficiently alone to talk seriously. Let me begin. I know that we have a disagreement over the right to the throne, but something else is in danger right now that overrules our differences. Sabinus, according to my sources, is likely to take Jerusalem and the temple treasury sometime between Passover and Shavuot. This will be the death of any hope for our independence." "Don't you think you are a little young for this sort of thing?" laughed Athrongis. "What are you, all of 19 or 20? I know you have been very successful and have quite a reputation under many other names, but you are still too young. Who will take you seriously?" "Jerusalem, the temple treasury," Jude emphasized. "We must talk about these issues. Time is quickly getting away from us. I tell you that in this thing we must consolidate our forces. You can keep yours, but we must join now and bring as many others as will join us. If we act as if we are only going up to Jerusalem for Passover and subsequent celebrations, we will not be noticed. There will be nothing more to the Romans' eyes than a larger number than usual devoted faithful. We can encompass the city and take it. We have so little time." "The temple treasury, huh?" asked Athrongis. "My concern, of course, has always been Mount Ephraim and the promises to them. What concern have I for the temple? Again, despite our differences, our peoples have placed their riches there, have offered them to Hashem. Even if Herod and the Romans pollute the temple, the heart, the sweat, and even the blood of the people are still there. More importantly for you, though, is the chance to break the will of the Romans and the collaborators. It is a chance to give them a wound which shall not heal." Jude was passionate. Athrongis looked at him for several seconds before he answered. The answer was a surprise. "Yes, Jude, I see your point. We have a confederation. Let us begin our planning together." Sabinus had finally concentrated his efforts at Jerusalem. With the legion Varus left him and the assistance of Joser, he was now prepared to use any ruse to accomplish his designs of greed. But the fates were stacking up in a way he had not considered. As was the custom, this was the time of year that many in the land traveled to Jerusalem for the holy days between Passover and Shavuot anyway. This time the pilgrimage was also a cover for the resistance, whose leaders believed that Sabinus had designs on the very temple treasury itself. They were, of course, not incorrect. After the Passover and just before Shavuot, Sabinus ordered the legion in Jerusalem to seal the gates of the temple. At the same time, several cohorts of soldiers surrounded Jerusalem. No one was allowed to enter or leave under pain of death. Romulus, I am now going to be the richest man in the world, second only to Caesar himself, Sabinus stated boldly. We have led Varus and even the emperor into a concern that Judea is on the verge of total collapse because of the uprisings and commotions we have been able to engineer for our benefit. As a result, I have been given a free hand in ruling this country, allowing me to plunder it for Caesar's glory. He paused and laughed. And mine. Without a report to Varus of a revolt in Judea and even Jerusalem itself, no one will question my subjugation of the temple to destroy the last remnants of this wicked religion and its people. Indeed, Procurator, you have been brilliant, Romulus praised Sabinus. Who else could have even obtained the assistance of the high priest in bringing about such a momentous and total defeat of these ungrateful people? Your Excellency, a voice came from the main entrance. The men turned to look. We have relieved the temple of a great portion of the offerings that were kept in it, and are now preparing the great wealth we have found there for transport to wherever you command. It was just then that Joser entered the procurator's palace. Ah, Joser, Sabinus welcomed the high priest. We have succeeded, and you will receive a great reward. But the high priest did not seem so confident or happy. Your Excellency, I am the bearer of grave tidings. There is, even now, a force of tens of thousands of armed revolutionaries approaching the city. Somehow your plot was perceived, and this counter set in motion long before this day. See for yourself from any high vantage point. Sabinus and his companions nearly ran to the top of the king's palace where Sabinus kept himself. They viewed the area surrounding the city on all sides. The cohorts placed around the walls of the city were under heavy attack from the armies that had surprised them. What have I done? Cried Sabinus. He realized it almost immediately. By consolidating my forces too soon and with no security in the countryside, I signaled my intentions. And without that security, these forces were able to quickly join. Who is their commander? He asked Joser. How should I know, Your Excellency? There are many leaders of these people. Who could be their one Mashiach? I know not, replied Joser. But I had better leave you and return to the temple, lest I be detected and we lose what influence I may have. Agreed. Go now, ordered Sabinus. Joser took his leave without a moment's delay. Send a courier immediately to Varus and request his help with haste. Send it now before the siege makes any escape impossible, he ordered Ammius, who ran to the commander of the legion who had his post at the entrance to the Antonia fortress, but was now also on the top of the palace watching the battle unfold. After receiving Romulus's directive, he immediately left for the fortress. Your Excellency, a senior Roman officer saluted as he entered the tower of the palace. We have received word by courier that there are several attacks occurring simultaneously throughout the countryside. This uprising may be a general action across all of Palestine. We have not the strength to counter them. I suggest we consolidate our forces now inside the walls and defend the city. We must send word to Caesarea and to Antioch. We have allies in the field, but the situation has turned grave quite quickly and unexpectedly. Sabinus had to stop and think. There was too much coming too fast for him to adequately process. He was silent for several minutes. Romulus spoke up. Your Excellency, I would advise that we concentrate our forces at our immediate disposal into the city at several critical points. Those would be at the Hippodrome, the east wall of the city, and the western wall of the city here at the palace. These are the likely points of the enemy's main effort. What other forces we have after that commitment we should have at various points around the perimeter of the city and keep a reserve at the Antonia fortress to counter any major breach of the defenses. Sabinus wanted to respond in a rage and defend his honor, reminding Romulus that it was he, Sabinus, who was the great military commander, the great procurator. But he realized that his lack of planning and attention had now created in him a form of stupor due to the gravity of the events building upon him in such a short time. It's a disaster that our forces have not gathered the evidences of these developments over the last while. What happened to those responsible for gaining information about the enemy and about these revolutionaries? Why were we caught off guard? He looked directly at Romulus. Romulus knew the answer, but dared not state it. He thought to himself that the objective of taking the riches of the country as plunder had become the object of Sabinus's concentration at the total expense of sound military and political activities. They had not considered all aspects of the information that was available, only that having to do with the plunder, forgetting that the people might indeed revolt at last. Your Excellency, Our focus was not on a general rebellion of such magnitude, probably because we did not see it as an option for the revolutionary leaders. I have failed you, Romulus said, bowing his head in shame. Yes, you have, and Sabinus drew his sword and beheaded Romulus on the spot. The body stood for a second and then crumpled to the floor, the head rolling several feet away and finally stopping next to a golden vase. Sabinus yelled at a Roman officer, "Do as Romulus directed. Place forces at the east wall, the hippodrome, and the west of the palace. Keep a reserve at the fortress and intermittent security forces around the wall of the city as we are able." "As you command, hail Caesar," responded the officer. "Yes, hail Caesar," Sabinus coughed, a lump in his throat making it difficult for him to breathe. The officer immediately left and commanded his subordinates to deploy their forces. "Do what you can to bring the remnants of the cohorts outside the city into the walls, but do not risk further casualties, as we need every soldier. I will deliver these orders from the procurator to the legion commander. Now go." The subordinates saluted and separated to their areas of responsibility. The Roman officer then proceeded directly to the legion commander at the fortress of Antonia. Confusion reigned in Jerusalem and outside its walls for several hours. The defending Romans and Herodians made every effort to return those who had been caught outside in the surprise attack. Most had been salvaged and were now available for the internal defense and lines of communication that would prove invaluable in countering the siege. Roman archers selectively volleyed on the attackers as the occasion permitted, and this allowed them to keep the enemy forces from approaching the walls for several hours. But the reverse was true as well. No one could now leave Jerusalem without suffering death or capture. The siege had begun. Jude stood on the Mount of Olives, viewing the forces he commanded. While he was only one of several leaders of factions involved in the siege, his negotiations and alliances were working quite well. His responsibility was the eastern wall of the city. The result of his political and military skills was now before him as he stood ready to defeat the Romans and recover Israel's liberty. Jude's forces assisted an attack on the city from three sides, just as Romulus had predicted. The resistance army attacked at the hippodrome, the east wall, and the area of the king's palace. The idea was to close the Romans in and press the fight. Jude had been primarily responsible for the spies in the city, and he used the spies to inform him of dispositions of troops and the general condition of the inhabitants who were unable to flee before the assault began. He then gave his information to the other revolutionaries, principally Athronges and another named Yitzhak. Yitzhak, however, had left the siege to attack Romans and collaborators throughout the countryside to create diversions and prevent possible Roman reinforcements to the area of Jerusalem. Jude's intentions were clear. All his future plans, the survival of Israel, and the purity of the temple all depended on regaining liberty, starting here at Jerusalem. "I will command from the highest tower of the Phasaelis fortress," Sabinus instructed his aide. "Ensure that you inform the legion commander so he can establish lines of communication with me." In reality, Sabinus desired that location not only to observe the battle, but also for his own safety, and the aide realized it. "Yes, Your Excellency," responded the aide, and he hastened to the legion commander to report as Sabinus had instructed him. Sabinus rushed to the Phasaelis fortress and climbed to the very top to watch as the siege progressed. He could immediately see that the Jewish fighters had not yet consolidated their positions, and Sabinus gave the Roman commander the order to fall upon the Jews outside the west wall. The counterattack force was nearly a cohort in size, and it rushed in mass outside the gate against Herod's palace, falling upon the Jews and inflicting a terrible slaughter. The Romans discovered that this group of revolutionaries was poorly equipped and trained. Many of the fighters were armed only with rocks, some having slings with which to hurl them. They were no match for the Roman soldiers, who pierced their line and drove them back into the north of the city. The Romans slew hundreds of Jewish fighters while suffering only a few casualties themselves. Sabinus, watching from the tower, felt a rush of hope for his deliverance. But then, just as quickly, he could see that some of the rebels ran around the north wall and began ascending the wall to reach the cloisters above the outer court of the temple, where they again continued to hurl stones and arrows at the defenders of the city. The rebel archers shot their arrows with deadly accuracy from the top of the cloisters down upon the defenders. The height of the cloisters was such that the Roman archers on the ground could not gain sufficient elevation to engage the enemy. As a result, the stones and arrows from the Jews on the cloisters were causing numerous casualties among the defenders down below. At the same time, the rebel forces on the west managed to break through the defenses and enter the city. But they could not reach beyond the citadel near to Herod's palace due to the ferocity of the defense by the Romans and King Herod's soldiers under the command of Gratus. While Gratus had checked the breach, the fighting now settled to several days of attrition, neither side gaining much over the other. During this time, Sabinus stayed in the tower of Phasaelus fortress, not even interested in descending for the sake of his friends. He paced the floor and constantly ran his fingers over his face and through his hair. He would sit down and then stand again, finding no comfort. His dispatch to Varus should have reached him, but he had no certainty of it. On the morning of the 5th day of the siege, Jude could see by his observation from the Mount of Olives that the Romans had commenced some activity below the cloisters of the temple. He realized too late that their intention was to set fire to the cloisters, thereby consuming the rebel attackers on top of them. The fire was roaring nearly out of control before Jude's runner could reach the wall of the city. Jude could now only watch. The flames spread quickly and murderously due to the coverings on the wood used for their decoration and preservation. Without any direct route off the cloisters, the Jewish fighters were trapped save those who could begin the descent, and that only a few. Those still struggling to inflict casualties upon the Romans found themselves engulfed in the fast-moving inferno, their clothes and then their bodies catching fire. These fell from the heights and perished in large numbers. Jude and Sabinus both watched with equally disparate emotions, as many of these hopeless ones chose their own blades to the punishment of the fire, hurling themselves onto their own swords when they perceived that there was no chance of escape. Most, however, became walking torches and then disappeared from sight. Among those successfully managed to obtain to the ladders met nearly an immediate end as those who died from the fire. Jude could now see the Romans systematically killing those zealots who had begun the descent, Roman arrows unleashing a merciless fusillade against those on the ladders as their swords also cut down the desperate and disorganized zealots who reached the bottom. Not one of those brave souls who had ascended to the cloisters escaped. All were killed. Sabinus was gleeful, as much for the defeat of the brave rebels on the heights of the cloisters as the scene which next greeted his eyes. The Roman soldiers now rushed through the areas where the fire had subsided and relieved that portion of the temple of its treasure, that which was the sacred money of the temple. The soldiers took much for themselves, but Sabinus sent word that 400 talents were his, and his alone. As Jude stood watching, his legs weakened, and he sat down heavily on the ground, unable to control his anguish. He did manage to send word to Athrandus of the catastrophe. He soon received a message from his compatriot that they should encompass the palace and concentrate their forces there. Jude saw the wisdom of the suggestion and immediately ordered many of his forces to join at Herod's palace. There, they gathered torches and began threatening to burn the palace and all inside. The Romans, cut off by their retreat beyond the palace of Agrippa at the surge of the rebels through the gates and over the walls near Herod's palace, dared not attempt an attack through the narrow streets. Such a maneuver, with nearly no frontal power due to the narrow passages, would prevent them from safely overwhelming the enemy to any satisfaction that would make the attack worthwhile. They decided to defend the areas they controlled, and that offered the best means of repulsing any attacks. It was at this point that Jude and Athrandus learned that Varus was now approaching through the Galilee. Athrandus agreed to take a portion of his forces and tried to engage Varus, slowing his progress. Yitzhak could only do so much. Jude, on the other hand, would stay with the forces at Jerusalem. Athrandus left and traveled north with the forces he selected for the delaying actions. At the city, the threat by Jude to burn the palace convinced many inside to surrender, especially the majority of King Herod's troops. However, Gratus and another of Herod's commanders, Rufus, refused to join the rebels, even though Jude promised that they would not be harmed if they left. Knowing that those remaining would fight to the death and unable to inflict the suffering by fire he saw upon the cloisters, Jude continued with the siege of the palace, digging mines and passages under it to weaken its structure and seek other ways to enter it. Sabinus watched it all from the tower, still safe from the weapons of the rebels. He now understood that the entire area of Palestine continued in upheaval. Varus was his only hope of survival. But once Varus arrived, he would have a great deal of explaining to do. He now began to weigh his options, even considering the possibility of escape from Varus once Varus had broken the siege. Varus, having received the request from Sabinus as well as dispatches with commanders at Caesarea and even Herod, had immediately formed his forces, several legions from Syria, and attacked the Galilee in an unrelenting drive south to Jerusalem. He burned Sepphoris and, because the people there seemed to back the resistance, he enslaved most of them, sending them back to Rome and elsewhere. Small groups of Jude's forces joined in the effort to conduct a number of delaying actions to keep the Romans at bay while his main forces surrounded the Roman legion at Jerusalem. At the same time, elements of Athrandus' forces were now engaging the Romans in an effort to slow Varus's advance, but it was too little and too late. Nothing could stop the Roman juggernaut, and many of the Jews began to realize that their hopes were slipping away. Varus then marched to Samaria to destroy any evidence of resistance there, but he found that they had not joined the sedition against Rome or involved themselves in the civil war amongst the Jews, so he ignored them. He turned south and took Sampho, Emmaus, and finally Jerusalem, where the resistance had besieged the Roman legion commanded by Sabinus. Having found themselves at odds with the Romans at the same time, the various factions of the resistance had no choice but to consolidate their forces against this concentration of Romans attacking from the north. The siege had been quite successful, but the actions to delay Varus were paramount to victory. That, Jude realized, was untenable. The resistance could not continue to fight on two fronts, especially against the superior forces of Varus. Jude and Athronges' forces began to withdraw from Jerusalem. Jude returned to Damascus to again take up the life of an apparently devoted Essene, a cover that had worked for a very long time and would continue to do so. But the withdrawal was not quick enough for all of the resistance forces to escape. Varus caught up with several of the larger forces and fought them, capturing about 2,000 men belonging to Jude and Athronges. Archelaus, a son of Herod the Great, captured one of Athronges' brothers as he made his way back north. Two of Athronges' other brothers were killed in battles with the forces of Ptolemy and Gratus. The final brother surrendered to Archelaus after his force was decimated, and he had no choice but to ask terms. Archelaus agreed to accept his surrender and not kill him. Jude and most of his forces escaped. The siege broke, and many of the Romans sought out and welcomed Varus, but Sabinus hid from him. Knowing full well that his actions had brought these catastrophes upon the country and upon the legions of Caesar, he left Jerusalem under cover of disguise and fled to the seaside. He was never heard from again, and Caesar would eventually obtain the stolen treasures at Sabinus' storehouse at Caesarea. Varus assembled those captured to interrogate them as to the purpose of their cause and the leaders. Among the captured was Athronges, who was trying to secret himself within the mass of prisoners Varus had placed in a temporary stockade. While interrogating the prisoners, Varus's officers found that the vast majority of the captured had fought merely to rid foreigners from the land. He collected these from out of the number and addressed them all at once while under guard several furlongs from the camp. He found that these had no messianic interests. He spoke to them about the benefits of Roman rule to keep the peace and prevent such insurrections for the good of the people. At that, he forgave them and sent them away. He also sent a number of the lesser leaders back to Caesar for questioning. Caesar eventually forgave many of these, but those related in any way to Herod he executed for treason against the family. Varus decided to crucify about 2,000 of the prisoners because of their activities that he concluded were to seat a new Davidic king. During this procedure, he noted that one of them was commanding some attention. His officers told him that the man was Athronges, and that he claimed to be the Yehoshua ben Joseph of the Jews, a less often used appellation for a messianic leader, but not the Davidic king of the Judeans. It was not a familiar title to Varus, but he assumed it meant the same thing as a king. Varus brought him to a seat and pronounced the execution order directly upon him. He immediately delivered Athronges to a scourging in preparation for his execution by crucifixion. They removed his garments and left him wearing only his loincloth. Then the beatings began. Time and time again they spat on Athronges and struck him across the face and body with their hands and with sticks. They mocked him and begged him to resist in sarcastic tones, as they had a personal hatred for him as one who had caused the deaths of many of their own comrades. Athronges was already near unconsciousness, bleeding from his nose, ears, and mouth when they tied him to the upright stake upon which they would soon hang him in crucifixion. They took a pot of cold water and threw it on him to ensure he was conscious. Then they took turns beating him with the whip, which had pieces of sharp bone attached to the ends. Each strike tore more flesh from Athronges' body, racking him with indescribable pain. He gasped for breath and screamed at every lash. The continuing thought in his mind was that he would never again see his loved ones. This was the dread that left him even more weakened and destitute of hope. Maybe he should have cooperated more with Jude, but he would never tell the Romans about him, even if Jude were his rival. The fact as it made its impression on his mind was that, until the Romans could be defeated, he should have more fully allied himself with Jude. It was a mistake. Athronges could no longer see them clearly, his eyes swollen from the beatings. Furthermore, he had long since lost the concentration to pray and call upon Hashem for strength. Pain and desolation were all he perceived, and those were hardly real either. They then stood him up. He could detect that they were bringing the crossbeam for his crucifixion. They saw them put it on the ground. But he was delirious, merely moving as the guards commanded him, not sure of what it all meant. He seemed to be unable to formulate independent thought, but he realized that recognizing that state of mind in himself was reason enough to believe that he still had his senses to some degree. He no longer feared death or solitude. He simply accepted both. The soldiers pushed the Athrongis down onto the crossbeam while removing his loincloth, and then placed the crossbeam beneath his head and tied his arms to it. What he could only partially see filled his heart with terror. 2 soldiers, each carrying a hammer and an iron spike, were approaching his sides. Despite his understanding of the futility of resistance, he involuntarily attempted to avoid the fastening to the crossbeam. Familiar with the efforts of their victims in the past, several soldiers held Athrongis' massive but weak arms to the beam as one of them drove the rusted, dark brown spikes through his wrists below the joint, crushing the nerves and causing a new pain that swept Athrongis into a bitter agony that made death seem paltry. His arms and chest convulsed, the contractions searing his sanity, and yet not sufficient to bring on unconsciousness or death. His fingers and hands burned and ached with uncontrolled distortions. He kicked his legs and tore at his arm sockets in his attempts to flee the pain. Again, his actions were dictated not by reason or hope, but involuntary efforts of his body to escape the pain. The executioners then used a set of ropes and pulleys to lift the beam to which they had fastened Athrongis and placed it on the upright state. Now another form of intense pain enveloped his body, as his own weight caused the wounds in his wrists to feel as if they were tearing apart the very joints and muscles. Every breath was a labor of vanity. He faintly noticed a soldier with another spike approaching him as unseen hands held down his right leg hard against the upright. An unbearable pain filled his right foot and leg as he felt bones and sinews separate and shatter as a piercing blow through the spike through his foot at the instep. Then the same pain came right as the right foot was placed over the left, and the spike hammered through the instep of his left foot and into the upright. The tendons in his feet and calves contracted violently, sending new waves of excruciating pain throughout his beaten and abused body. Gathering himself as best he could, he looked down at his bare body exposed to the world, broken, bleeding, humiliated, and suffering. Why had he allowed this to happen? What good was it? He had failed in his attempt to defend the land against the invaders from Rome, the usurpers of Herod, and the false religions of the heathen Gentiles. Athrongis hung on the crossbeam for nearly 2 days. The birds had begun to peck at his open wounds and even his eyes. He could no longer see, and breathing was near impossible. He had long ago lost all sense of time and the environment surrounding him. Then he felt his legs shattered by an unseen object. A soldier had received orders to break the legs of all those who had not yet died from their wounds. The legion needed to move on. Immediately his lungs failed to expand and he felt his shoulders separate from their sockets. His subconscious effort to push himself up to breathe was no longer possible. His chest felt as if it was being ripped open and the spasms of the muscles tore from their new sinews. How long he was there he could not tell. Then he felt his arms and body being wrapped in cloth. Unseen hands were touching him and voices were consoling him, encouraging him to stay alive. Several of his followers had waited until the Romans left, and then they came to rescue him. They pried the nails from his flesh and bone and out of the wooden planks. His limbs limply fell to the side, and his head he could not control. They placed him upon a litter and dragged him several miles to a shelter on the side of a hill. There, they tried to nurse him to health, but the loss of blood and the injuries were too extensive. He was swept with fever as an infection raged within him. He died before morning.
Okay, because of the length of this chapter, I've decided to break it into 2 parts. So we just completed part 1, so this will be part 2 of chapter 4. Okay, here we go. Hopefully this will work. There we are. Continuing. So Athrongis died before morning. Jude was very angry that Joseph had not taken part in the attempt to return liberty to Israel. As Jude saw it, Joseph had kept himself from the dangers and had devoted his time to questionable meditations and domestic concerns of his family. He certainly had not conducted himself in a kingly manner. Jude approached his brother in Capernaum, and they agreed to meet on the shore near the fishing vessels. They met alone. Both brothers walked silently side by side for a short distance without saying a word. The breeze off the Sea of Galilee mingled strands of their hair, but their thoughts had no common ground. Finally, Jude spoke. Joseph, it is time we have a serious discussion. It seems to me that we no longer have any reason to question the airship. I'll just cut to the quick of it. You have made no attempt to act in the interests of the people or Hashem. The war we have fought over the last several months was our greatest chance to free ourselves. We did not fail because we were without you, but you have failed because you were not with us." Joseph did not remove his gaze from the sand, nor raise his voice to the ears of his brother. He continued walking as if all alone in thought. Jude looked at him and saw that his back was still slightly humped, and his frame still not as strong as that of Jude's. The realization brought Jude to empathy for his brother's frailty. He continued, but from a more gentle position. "In all our disagreements, we have never resorted to violence or hatred one for another. Admittedly, I cannot tolerate your insistence that you have any right to the throne of David, but you have also done nothing to trouble me concerning the matter." "Not really, at least not that I have seen, so I will trust it will remain so. Is that correct?" Joseph finally answered him, "My place is all that has transpired says of me. The crimson thread was placed upon my wrist, and I have not sold it." Jude was bewildered. "Then why don't you act more as if you claim it?" queried Jude. Joseph did not answer at first. The brothers walked some distance in silence, and then Joseph finally answered. "My time has not yet come," he said, turning to look into Jude's eyes. "So, when you think that time has come, will you more actively oppose me?" asked Jude. "We are not on the same path," responded Joseph. "But you claim the kingdom," asked Jude. "It is my burden," responded Joseph. Jude could not make sense of Joseph's answers. He seemed totally without emotion or aggression towards what Jude was saying, and there was no avarice in Joseph's eyes. Jude felt he needed to press the issue no longer. "I must return to Damascus," Jude said. "Let me know of any issues that come into your mind." Joseph smiled and then said, "You will be one of the first to know when my place and time has arrived. Take your journey safely." The brothers embraced, and Jude left to meet his escort for the return to Damascus as Joseph made his way back to his home. The brothers shared the same thought, that they may never meet again. Unsure of the circumstances around him and still not fully capable of responding to the tyranny and destruction, Joseph continued in his efforts to strengthen himself in body and spirit. He and Miriam had many talks about his future and his responsibilities. As often as occasion would permit, he consulted with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea, and even Nicodemus Ben-Gurion, who was also a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish governing council. Joseph was convinced that the resistance against Rome and the Herodians was justified, but he could not, in good conscience, back Jude or the extremisms of the Nazarenes of Damascus. Like his father Cleophas, he felt the community had gone beyond for those who desired to had gone beyond the requirements of Torah in many ways. While it was proper for those who desired to take the additional restraints voluntarily, especially those of the priestly lineage, it concerned Joseph that they would often enforce requirements upon Jews and foreigners when there was no requirement for them to obey. While protection of the purity of Hashem's temple was tantamount, the temple built by Herod, with his depravity and defilements, in Joseph's view, probably had no legitimacy whatsoever. Joseph looked to Shiloh, a small area northwest of Jerusalem, as the proper place for the temple. The temple's main purpose had been to serve as a house for the Ark of the Covenant, which held the stone tablets upon which Hashem had written the Ten Commandments for Israel. But the Ark, the true purpose of the temple, was no longer there. It had been missing for hundreds of years. Yet, he was not sure where he could find the answer to his dilemma. He felt confident he was the Mashiach ben David, the king-to-be for all Israel. But what was his responsibility as far as priestly duties? Should he return to the priest-kings of his forefathers? Could he slay the Katim and the backsliders of the Jews? Should he? Joseph decided he needed to return to On for instruction, and he made the proper preparations. He decided to take his family with him. This was the defining moment of his life, for he felt that only the priests of On would guide him through the Jewish mystical secrets that he needed to finally master in order to make the proper decisions about himself and the future of Israel. Also, he needed to ensure that he and Miriam completed a required ritual for him to fulfill the terms of Davidic kingship. He would remain there for several years, refining his understandings, building his family, and strengthening his alliances. He was still at a young age for a man to study the secrets of Jewish mysticism, but he felt it necessary to complete this training as soon as possible so he could take on his leadership role in earnest. He and his mother Miriam discussed it at length. Yosef, of course I recognize why you see On as so important. So do I. But doesn't the community have these same methods? They have safeguarded these things since Zerubbabel. She loved Yosef and his family and just really did not want them off to Egypt and so far away. Yosef had been gone so much as a child and very young man. Mother, you know I am not eligible for Damascus. Growing up there from time to time I was accepted, but never actually a part of it. My feelings about the extreme interpretations of Torah, and especially my back where the bend is making me ineligible in my own mind, and certainly by the rules of the community. Besides, all they talk about is the priesthood of Aaron, the Kohanim. While they accept and encourage righteousness to the point of the priesthood of Melchizedek, they set a path to get there I cannot follow. You know my interest in On. Oh, son, Miriam interrupted, I know what you are going to say. Remember, my father, Heli, was named after On. They mean the same thing. We both know why. And I know the family and friends there will treat you so well, as will those in northern Egypt. I can even understand their reticence to come here with all the difficulties and dangers. But this is the home of our fathers. This is where we should be. When we left Egypt with Moses many generations ago, we brought On with us and established it at Shemesh. Part of it is there, and part of it is here in Damascus. Maybe those in Shemesh can accomplish what you search for. As I said, Mother, answered Joseph, Damascus is not going to accept me, even if Yochanan were to invite me. Besides, while On went to Shemesh, the greater part of the mysteries were taken back to On when the captivity occurred. You know that. And Mother, Joseph looked deep into her eyes, the prophecy is that Hashem will call his sons out of Egypt. In many ways a metaphor, but as pertaining to me, I must return and obtain the full initiation of the secrets of Moses. Yes, Joseph, you received the crimson thread, I know, sighed Miriam. Your works have been wonderful, Joseph, but honestly, look at what Jude has accomplished for Israel. Look at what Jacob has done. I love you, son, but this is not for you. Joseph smiled lovingly at his mother. He understood her and her difficult situation. Mother, I will be in On very soon. I will send you word as often as occasion permits. Miriam smiled and hugged her son. Yes, I know. You cannot blame a grandmother for trying. Joseph and his family departed for On within the next few days. At about the same time, as if designed to give credence to Joseph's concerns for his people, Augustus Caesar decreed a census and a tax. Caesar assigned Coponius as governor of the land and appointed the Roman senator Cyrenius to preside over the census. Joseph wanted nothing to do with this Roman villainy and desired to protect his children from the methods of the Romans would use to gather and use the information. According to Torah, Israel was not to be numbered, and taxation of Hashem's people by the Romans was, in his sight, an abomination. His brothers, however, considered his departure merely another manifestation of his cowardice. But Joseph was concerned only with his preparations for his destiny, and he could let nothing deter him from that quest and a sure knowledge of Hashem and his principles. Jacob met him in Beth Shemesh to try and dissuade him from his journey. They met at Rabbi Eliezer's home along the Dismas River. My brother, Jacob saluted him, it is a gift from Hashem that you and your family are well. But what are your concerns for Israel? Jude, your brother, risked all he has, indeed his very life, to defend the people and the land against the Kittim. Do you not feel strongly that you should do the same? Jacob was never one to hold back the words he felt may be necessary to effect resolution of an issue. To Joseph, this seemed to be not only an insult, but also another claim that he was abrogating his birthright. Jacob, Joseph began, how is it that you, one of those closest to the mysteries, cannot see that my path is defined by Hashem, not by men? If I follow man because of what he expects of me and ignore Hashem's call, what does it profit? Jude is following the dictates of Hashem, and so should you by doing all in your power to help us overcome the Kittim, Jacob painfully explained. There is a time and season for everything, and it is now the season to fight the Kittim for the honor of Hashem and the establishment of a free Israel. And how is it to be accomplished? Asked Joseph. The war has gone on for many years, and Jude, even with his alliances, cannot break the grip of the Emperor of Rome. The eagle's talons are locked, and it will hover above the carcass and feed off it until there is nothing left. Anyone who looks and perceives can see it. Why not you and Jude? No. I go to seek the will of Hashem and my relationship to him. That, above all else, is my task. Jacob could not really contradict Joseph's words. He knew, as did Joseph, that above all, Hashem had commanded them to seek for him. Yes, Joseph, what you say is true. He paused and looked out over the hills. He could see Joseph's family quietly waiting for him. The air was calm, and no sound penetrated to his ears, no sign presented to his eyes, and no words formed in his heart. He sighed. Your search for Hashem is admirable, my older brother. To have Hashem's word and will revealed to you, and thereby aiding Israel, may be as important, even more so, than combating the Kittim and spilling their blood in your own. Our mother also has seen your departure as needful for you, and possibly to merely allow Jude his space. Hopefully, you understand he deserves my loyalty, and his courage is like that of a lion. Joseph smiled and looked at his younger brother, who, despite his strong feelings, was obviously maturing into a much wiser man. While Joseph recognized that Jacob still held to the extremes of his Nazaritism and the dictates of the severity of the law beyond the mark, he could not fault his brother for his dedication and loyalty. That was an indication of his spiritual strength and fortitude that Joseph could easily mold later, if Hashem desired. Jacob, my brother, Joseph spoke and placed his right hand on Jacob's shoulder. The dangers of fighting the Romans do not frighten me. Hashem says to us that he is to be our fear and our dread. Do you not recall your meditations? We will return when I have a greater understanding of Hashem and the Hecalot. The brothers could formulate no more words between them. It was obvious both were set on their individual paths. They looked at each other for a long moment and then embraced. Joseph then departed and returned to his family to continue the journey west to On. A thought came into Jacob's mind as he watched his brother leave. The words of his thoughts came to his mouth, and he uttered them quietly. Yes, Joseph must be considered a warrior, he pondered as he nodded his head, a breeze now catching the locks of his hair and blowing them toward the back of his head. He recalled the dangers of the higher meditations and the angels who guarded the paths and the gates with drawn swords ready to destroy the unworthy who attempted to approach the higher realms. Whose wrath would I rather face? That of a Roman centurion or one of the armed angels of the heavens like Capsiel or Metatron? Joseph would be gone for 10 years. The tax of the people of Judea and Galilee unsettled the entire nation and even neighboring diaspora Jews. While relations between the establishment high priest Joser and the Torah-dedicated Sadducees had been strained for some time, Joser's support of the Romans in collecting the tax was the catalyst for Jude to divide the faithful from the Herodians. As with Joseph, this was a straw that broke the camel's back, as the Torah-faithful Jews had no intention of honoring Caesar by giving him their strength that should go to Hashem. Despite the efforts of the Herodian Jewish rulers to try and keep the people in line, things were quickly spinning out of control. Jude and Jacob again seized the opportunity presented them by the census of Cyrenius. Using his oratory skills to the maximum, Jude pushed for an all-out revolt against Rome, telling his countrymen that they would be cowards to pay the tax. He convinced the people to whom he spoke of the necessity of liberty from foreign oppressors so that the people could worship Hashem as their laws required. A split occurred between the Sadducees along the lines of supporting the Romans in their tax or resisting the same. Joser, the high priest, led the group supporting the Romans in the establishment. Jude and Jacob led those who were against the census and the tax, and the faithful who were trying to follow the Torah. There was widespread support for Jude and Jacob, and this support grew stronger as each year passed. As for Jude, Yochanan, and Jacob, they believed that the collaborators with the Romans and the Herodians, those who were foreigners and not Jews, but pretended to be Jews, had polluted the temple. More and more of the people realized the same thing as time progressed. The Messianic movement was gaining momentum. Simon, Jude's brother, remained the greatest of the fighters. They continued to call him Kepha, or Rock, for that is what he was. He had remained reliable, steadfast, violent, and faithful to the community. He looked to his older brothers, Jude and Jacob, as the heirs of the Messianic titles, and he supported them without question. He had led a lion's share of the raids, producing stores of supplies for the zealots while filling the Romans with dread when they traveled through isolated areas of the country. He had also recruited some stalwart Jews to the movement. But the Romans were never positive of the identities of these Damascus Essenes. Their cover as ascetic, pious, otherworldly worshippers put the Romans and some of the Herodians off guard. As these events were unfolding, the Roman governor Coponius and the Roman senator Cyrenius removed Joseph from the position of high priest. They replaced him with Ananus. Along with this, they appointed the Herodian rulers merely as tetrarchs over much smaller areas. Over the next several years, the succeeding Roman governors continued to remove and appoint new high priests from the Herodian establishment who had no legitimate claim to the office. The office went from Ananus to Ismael, then to Eleazar the son of Ananus, then to Simon son of Comithus, and then to Joseph Caiaphas. This entire administrative activity had nothing to do with the Israelite law of succession of the lineal descendants of the high priest. These men either bought the high priesthood with bribes to the Romans or were all Herodians, Roman puppets. This action further incited the flames of revolt against Rome and was proof to the Jews that Rome had no intention of honoring their laws and customs. Bloodshed increased in Palestine. The Romans and Herodians tried to maintain control while the zealots of the Jews attempted to disrupt their administrations and attack their interests. This Roman effort to control the situation continued with some success for the next few years, but as a result of the uprising, Rome continued to tighten its grip on all of Palestine. In approximately 18 AD, Caesar sent a new governor to Judea. The man, Pontius Pilate, had earned Caesar's respect because of his administrative skills that enabled him to accumulate a great deal of wealth. But Pilate was also an ambitious and ruthless demagogue who would employ any stratagem to obtain the desired results. Caesar needed such a man to bring order to Palestine. However, it was a gamble as well, for Pilate proved to be more brutal in dealing with the attacks and activities of the resistance, torturing and crucifying hundreds, maybe thousands of Jews. The scales could go either way, forcing the Jews to capitulate and willingly submit to Roman authority, or catapulting them into a more widespread and deadly revolt. The Herodians were also attempting to gain a more firm control over the land, but despite all their efforts, they could not effectively convince the lineal Jews to cease their revolutionary acts, even with widespread bribes, torture, and threats of denial of access to the temple. The Herodian priesthood, with Roman encouragement, began instituting requirements of an oath of loyalty from the people before allowing the individuals into the inner courts of the temple of Herod. Without this certification, the Jews could not find a place to worship. Losing their temple access was something most of them could not bear, and this act alone prevented some of the Jews from otherwise actively assisting the resistance because they held their access to the temple in higher esteem than overthrowing the Roman powers. To pay for these additional actions, the Herodian priests and leaders brought merchants and money changers into the temple, where they would collect what amounted to a tax for the oath and the right to enter the temple to offer prayers or sacrifices. The normal duties of these changers had been to ensure that only coins without forbidden images produced by Jews were used in the temple. But even that appeared to be changing as Caesar's image appeared more and more often on coins offered for the temple treasury. All of this only further angered the community and the zealots. Against the wishes of some of his followers, Yochanan ben Zechariah decided to more openly accuse the establishment priests and leaders of the Herodians as sinners and usurpers not fit for the kingdom of Hashem. Whenever he left Damascus, he removed his white linen robes and donned sackcloth to emphasize his message. He openly began preaching of the coming of the end times and the retribution Hashem would take upon the liars and deceivers of the covenant, who everyone knew were the Herodian priests. He openly accused them of incest and sleeping with women during their periods, then entering the temple as unclean, taking multiple wives and committing the same actions with each of them, marrying and divorcing at a whim, and also sacrificing to idols in the temple. Most of these, to one degree or another, were prohibited by Torah and further restricted by Yochanan. Furthermore, he proclaimed that Hashem, through his Mashiach, would overthrow the Romans. Since he was in rag clothes of sackcloth and of a generally unkempt appearance, railing against the Herodian leadership and actually making a comic spectacle of their lives, the Romans did not consider him necessarily an immediate threat. He was playing with fire, but at this point the Romans merely considered him mad. That allowed him to continue for a much longer time than otherwise possible. But the Herodians were sure they knew differently. Their spies had seen him throughout Judea, obviously commanding a large number of followers from all walks of life, even the Essenes from Damascus. While he did not seem to have a close association with the scenes, as the immerser, as Yochanan was also called, did not dress like them when he was outside Damascus, he did have those around him who had been seen conducting Sicarii operations. Their activities were getting out of hand, and Yochanan seemed to fire their passions in liberty and nationalism. Zealots had again begun seizing anyone not of Jewish descent who talked about the Torah and demanded that they be circumcised. If they refused, the Zealots killed them, saying it was a requirement of their law. One such tragedy took place outside of Jerusalem, where a Roman soldier and young Herodian were discussing Torah and Jewish customs. Jude's lieutenant Laban and a group of 11 zealots, dressed not in their white linens but as simple peasants, approached the Damascus gate near nightfall. They had prepared themselves for a strike against the Kittim and the Herodians, one that would send a message to the invaders and, they hoped, please Hashem. Many of the independent zealot groups were beginning to do the same thing, and Laban wanted to ensure Jude's honor amongst them so as to strengthen Jude's position for the throne. The opportunity came easily as Laban spotted the two men and overheard their discussion when he and his men passed close to the Damascus gate where the two men stood talking. Once beyond the earshot of the Roman, Laban stopped his men and gathered them close around him next to a turn in the wall where the Roman could not see them. My brethren, what you have just witnessed is an attempt by a usurper to disrespect Hashem's law by informing the Kittim soldier, explained Laban. The Torah is to us, the rightful heirs, not to Goyim. As the teacher has instructed, this angers Hashem and defiles all of us. It is right for us to act to avenge this encroachment. As Laban talked, he removed an object wrapped in linen from the bag he kept attached to his wrist. Unfolding the linen revealed a small, flat, smooth stone designed for circumcision, sharpened on the end to an edge capable of shaving a man's beard from his face. As required by Torah, I will use this on the Roman. You, he nodded towards a zealot named Tadai ben Netanyahu, will check the Herodian. Tadai immediately withdrew his circumcision stone for his own bag and began to unwrap it from its linen. If he is not circumcised, do so. The rest of you will take them to the ground and hold them until Tadai and I have done the duty. The men all began to prepare themselves for the confrontation, checking their sickers beneath their clothes and preparing cords of linen to bind the victims. This would be no easy task. No man, including the weakest of men, would resist any violation of the integrity of his manhood, even to the point of inflicting death on those seeking to do such a deed. As the zealots made their final preparations, Laban peered around the protrusion in the stone wall, a gust of wind blowing particles of dust into his eyes. He shielded his face and blinked to wash away the stinging grit. Once he had cleared his vision, he looked again. He could see that the two men were so involved in the discussion that they were nearly oblivious to everything around them. So it is for all men who study Torah, Laban whispered to himself, even those who are unworthy. But it will work to our advantage. He then motioned for the zealots to follow him. As they turned toward the gate and began to pass the Roman and the Herodian, they all pulled their shawls up over their heads to help conceal their identities, and Laban's followers seized the two prey. The Roman attempted to fight and call for help, desperately trying to maneuver his lance for a strike, but the zealots succeeded in taking the lance from him and laying hold of his armored torso to try and force him to the ground, their drawn sickers waving threateningly near the Roman's face. He managed to draw his short sword, but Laban struck it from his grip with a sharp blow from his own sicker. The force of Laban's blow and the weight of the other zealots finally took the Roman to the dirt. Tadai's group had no trouble. When they seized the Herodian and placed their sickers to his throat, he whimpered and fell to the ground almost voluntarily. It made Tadai think that the little usurper probably had no idea what was about to befall him if he was found not to have already obeyed the Torah. If he did, he would likely not have succumbed so easily. The zealots with Laban now secured the Roman silence with a linen rag pulled tightly around his throat and pinned him to the ground with their hands while they fastened more linen cords about his limbs. The linen about his throat cut off his air like a garrote, and an initial panic seized him. He struggled all the more ferociously, trying to kick and strike his assailants. But with little oxygen to fuel his efforts, his struggles were obviously losing their effectiveness, and he seemed to realize the uselessness of his resistance. With thoughts of impending death and no way to alert his fellow soldiers or cry for help, he said his prayers to Jupiter and prepared to enter the afterlife. It was then that he felt the tug on his clothing that obviously exposed his genitals. He made the effort to look down, and he saw a man holding a sharpened stone and moving it toward his groin. He again began to struggle, this time with all the might every fiber of his body could gather. He managed to free his right leg and kick the unseen man, who held it so hard that the man fell backwards, allowing the Roman to now use the free leg to kick at those about him. But, almost when he thought he might free himself, his leg was again immovable and pinned to the ground. All he could do was arch his back and rock slightly from side to side. The man holding the linen rope about his throat now tightened it, and the lack of air brought on a stupor upon the Roman's mind, almost to unconsciousness. A small number of men and women who were traversing the area of the gate stopped for but moments to watch the scene before them. Most of Jerusalem was now at supper, a few traveling the paths about the outside of the city. Those who did witness the disturbance were not numerable enough to be of any real concern to the zealots, and few remained long enough to see the details. Most knew that it was better for them to put distance between them and the skirmish, as more soldiers could arrive and exact revenge. The Herodian was also now bound and gagged to prevent him from making audible screams, and he could see what was about to befall his Roman friend. The terror of the moment seized him, for he knew he had not obeyed the Torah, and was, as the Roman, about to lose a part of his anatomy. He felt the tightening of the linen rag about his throat and a tug about his hips. He then saw a man with a shawl over his face holding an object in his right hand. The dim light of the torches reflected a small glint off the object, and the Herodian realized it also to be a circumcising stone. Realizing their intent, he struggled as he had never done before in his life, but was overpowered by the strength and number of his captors. He gnashed his teeth and tried to scream, but only a muffled groan proceeded from his chest as he felt someone grab his member, stretching the foreskin with no intent of gentleness. He writhed in agony as the sharp edges of the stone cut through his taut flesh. The pain was such that no other sensation, no sound, no glowing light from the torches above the gate, nor even the efforts of his captors to immobilize his limbs made any impression upon his mind. "I almost have it," exclaimed Tadai to the men holding the Herodian to the ground. "There! It is done! Glory to Hashem! The Torah is honored!" He called out to all as he held the excised foreskin in his hand. The Herodian, now merely allowed by the zealots to curl up to try to hide himself and alleviate the pain, could see the blood about his legs and the mutilation of his organ. Between the pain and the exertion of the struggle, he lost consciousness and rolled further over onto his side. Finally, Laban was able to seize the foreskin of the Roman and stretch it to the length that allowed him to begin the removal. His method was well practiced, and the cuts were quick and precise. But even in his near unconsciousness, the pain to his member awoke the Roman to a new level of combativeness. As if receiving strength from pain, he again heaved his body and limbs at his attackers, forcing not only the man at his throat, but also the men holding his arms to lose their balance and fall backwards. He saw his shorts whirred in the dirt only 4 cubits from him, and despite the pain, leaped toward it and grasped it with his right hand. He saw his short sword. He saw his short sword in the dirt only a few cubits from him, and despite the pain, leaped toward it and grasped it with his right hand. Laban was caught off guard, even though the Roman's foreskin was in his hand. It was obvious the situation now turned to one of life and death. He stood and took a step backward, dropping the foreskin to the ground and drawing his sicker from beneath his clothing. As the Roman stood, blood trickling down his legs from the mutilation, staggering from the loss of blood and the exhaustion of the struggle, he waved his sword toward Laban. Laban backed away slowly. "Get going," Laban calmly ordered the zealots. There was no reason to encourage the taking of this Roman's life. The circumcision would be a meaningful message to the Romans and the Herodians. That was the important issue. As the zealots heeded Laban's command and made their escape back to the north and into the darkness, Laban lowered his sicker and followed them. The Roman tried to pursue them, but tripped over a stone and fell. Gathering what strength he had left, he kneeled on the ground, holding his groin. "You are cowards," he yelled as loud as he could, the emotion evident in his failing voice. "You have defiled me and stolen my manhood, you filthy Jewish vermin. I will hunt you down and see you all crucified," he shouted as he slowly collapsed to the ground. Just then, a maniple of roving Roman soldiers arrived and found the 2 victims lying in blood. Several of the soldiers tended to the Roman and Herodian, while others entered the city to call for reinforcements. The leader of the soldiers was horrified more by the mutilation of the men's organs than the attack itself. As he checked his injured soldier and the Herodian, he grimaced at the sight of their loss. He turned from the mayhem and peered out into the darkness, searching for any sign of the perpetrators. "We will do the same to you," he screamed in the night. "We will make you all women and then crucify you." The Romans' anger and hatred toward the zealots and all Jews grew from that day onward. Many Romans, Herodians, and foreigners were killed as a result of these fanatic interpretations of Torah. The more conservative of the Jews also thought these actions were beyond reason, prudence, and Torah. The extreme dictates of Yochanan were beginning to leak out as coming from him. So the Romans and Herodians needed to begin a plan that would take Yochanan out of the picture. The Herodian leadership became more afraid that the Romans might remove them from their seats if they did not remove the leaders of the resistance. As all this was coming to pass, Jude and Rachel, now well into their dynastic marriage, were still without a child. The extended separations required by Jude's work and the rules of the dynastic wedlock were taking their toll on Rachel, making her feel like the patriarch Abraham's wife Sarah, who did not conceive until she was in her old age. Her concerns for Jude's royal line made her the more desperate, as she realized that without an heir, the throne may be lost for him. But there was little that they could do about it other than pray to Hashem that her womb might be opened. They came together again in Kislev and Tevet, basically the month of December, and separated as required to await the possibility of pregnancy. They had followed this program for so long that even Jude was concerned about some other possible answers to the problem. Finally, in the month of Adar, February-March, Rachel could make the announcement that she was pregnant. Accompanied by community midwives, she calculated the time of the birth to be exactly as it should be, Tishrei, the month of Yom Kippur. If the child was born and survived, Jude would have his heir. To recognize the official nature of the pregnancy and receive Hashem's blessing that indeed Rachel represented the Shekinah through her becoming one flesh with Jude, the final ceremony of the dynastic marriage forging their bond forever was completed in Iyar, April or May. As expected, the baby arrived during the month of Tishrei amidst an outpouring of joy from Jude, Rachel, and their friends. The infant was a boy Jude named Jacob, and he would be the heir of his father. Following the commands of the Torah, Jude had Yochanan circumcise the baby, and the dynastic succession was well underway. Best of all, Joseph and his family were still in On and far from any influence over Palestine, the community, or the throne. Jude hoped Joseph would find On so much to his liking that he would never desire to return and interfere with Jude's plans. It had been nearly 10 years since his brother departed the land of his birth, and Jude looked upon the apparent self-imposed exile as a just reward for a wavering faith and a destructive but fortunate delusion of grandeur. As the community brethren and Jude's compatriots began to earnestly celebrate his apparent victory concerning the claim to the throne, Joseph of Arimathea sent a communication to Joseph regarding the attitudes in Judea, Galilee, and especially the community at Damascus. He emphasized that Jude was gaining more and more support, and that Joseph may indeed lose his birthright unless he returned quickly. Even then, Uncle Joseph cautioned in his letter, it may take an action by Hashem to correct the situation. Several days later, as night was approaching in On, the beginning of the new day, Joseph was preparing for another night of meditation at the temple in On, just a half a furlong from his home. Joseph was enjoying his family and friends, some of whom were the selected allies who had accompanied him to Egypt years before, and some who were new supporters he had gained while discussing Torah and the politics in Palestine. Many of these people had taken part in some of the rituals and instructions Joseph took upon himself, and all were edified as a result of their determination. Of course, none dedicated themselves to the levels Joseph had, but his evaluation of his studies and meditations suggested it was approaching the time where he could no longer be the student, but must take his position as the master, the example. It was time to claim his position, and he could only do that on the soil of his own country. As this issue became a point of discussion with those who surrounded him, a knock came to the door. Miriam looked at Martha, who immediately nodded and excused herself from the group. She opened the door and greeted a man she did not recognize, but she could see he had a scroll of what appeared to be Joseph of Arimathea's seal. She allowed him to enter, and he announced he had a message for Joseph from his uncle Joseph. As the courier delivered the scroll into Joseph's hands, Joseph knew the time had come to return home, even before he unfolded the document. So that's the end of chapter 4. We'll start on chapter 5. Sorry about me stumbling around a little bit. Like I say, I'm not a professional audible reader, I suppose. All right, we'll see you in chapter 5 out here.